Have you ever stood in a magnificent cathedral and looked at the altar? That grand, central piece of stone or wood, it feels so permanent, so ancient, as if it has been there since the beginning of time. But what if I told you that the altar we know today has a fascinating and surprisingly humble origin story? It is a journey that takes us from secret meetings in private homes to the grand basilicas of the Roman Empire. Today, we're going to uncover the incredible evolution of the Christian altar. Let's travel back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. In these early days, Christianity was a new, often persecuted faith. There were no dedicated church buildings. Instead, believers gathered in what were called house churches or domici. These were simply the homes of wealthier members of the community. In this intimate setting, there was no elaborate altar. The Eucharist, the central act of Christian worship, was celebrated on a simple, movable wooden table. It was practical, it was discreet, and it was a far cry from the stone structures we see today. Imagine this, a small group of people huddled together in a room, sharing a meal around a common table, just as they believed Jesus did with his disciples. This table wasn't seen as inherently sacred in itself. The sacredness came from the act performed upon it. The big shift happened in the year 313 AD, with the Edict of Milan. Emperor Constantine's decree legalized Christianity, and everything changed. The faith could finally come out of the shadows and into the open. Christians began building their own dedicated places of worship, and they modeled them after the grand public buildings of the Roman Empire. The basilica was a large, rectangular hall, and for Christian worship, the focal point naturally became the altar. But it wasn't just a matter of scaling up the old wooden table. A new and powerful influence was taking hold. The veneration of martyrs. Christians had always held a deep respect for those who died for their faith. They would often gather at their grave sites on the anniversary of their death to commemorate them. As purpose-built churches began to rise, a powerful new tradition emerged, building the church directly over the tomb of a martyr. The logic was profound. The martyr's sacrifice was the ultimate testament of faith, a perfect echo of Christ's own sacrifice. So, what better place to celebrate the Eucharist, the memorial of Christ's sacrifice, than directly above the remains of someone who had followed in his footsteps? This is where the altar begins its transformation. Instead of a movable wooden table, a permanent, fixed structure was needed. And what better material to use than stone? It symbolized permanence, strength, and eternity. The altar was no longer just a table. It became a tomb, a memorial, a sacred focal point all in one. It was built as a solid block or a table-like structure directly over the martyr's grave, which was often located in a crypt or underground chamber. This physical connection between the altar above and the saints' remains below was incredibly important. The sacrifice celebrated on the altar was now physically and spiritually linked to the sacrifice of the martyr resting beneath it. But what if you couldn't build your church over a martyr's tomb? The desire for this connection was so strong that a new practice developed. The translation of relics, the physical remains or personal belongings of a saint, were brought from their original burial sites and placed within or beneath the newly constructed altars. This allowed every church, no matter where it was built, to have that sacred link to the heroic figures of the faith. A small cavity, called a sepulchrum, was carved into the altar stone itself to house these precious relics. When a bishop consecrated a new altar, he would solemnly enclose the relics inside, sealing them as the spiritual heart of the church. The altar became This architectural and theological development led to the creation of something called the confessio. Don't confuse this with a confessional booth. In this context, confessio refers to the area around the martyr's tomb, which was made accessible to the faithful. In many great basilicas, like the old St. Peter's in Rome, a special opening or a small shaft, sometimes called a fenestella, was created. This allowed pilgrims to look down into the crypt and see the tomb of the saint, or even to lower pieces of cloth to touch the sarcophagus, turning them into secondary relics. The confessio created a multi-layered space of worship. Above, on the main floor, the clergy celebrated the Eucharist. Below, in the crypt, the faithful could offer their private prayers at the very tomb of the saint. It was a brilliant design that integrated public liturgy with private devotion. Over the centuries, this basic form continued to evolve. In the medieval period, altars grew more ornate. The retable or altarpiece, a decorative screen or panel with paintings or sculptures, was placed behind the altar, adding to its visual splendor. The focus shifted slightly from the tomb below to the dramatic reenactment of the sacrifice happening upon the altar itself. The priest, who in early basilicas often faced the congregation from behind the altar, began to celebrate Mass with his back to the people, facing the altarpiece and the symbolic east. This posture, known as ad orientem, emphasized that the priest and the people were all facing God together. However, even with these changes, the core concept established in the 4th century remained. The altar was still required by canon law to contain relics. That small piece of bone or dust sealed within the stone was a constant reminder of the church's foundation, built upon the faith and sacrifice of the saints who came before. It's a tradition that continues in many churches to this day. When a new Catholic church is consecrated, the bishop still embeds relics into its altar, connecting that brand new building to a chain of faith stretching back nearly 2,000 years. So, the next time you see a church altar, look at it with new eyes. It's not just a piece of furniture. It's a table, a tomb, a reliquary, and a monument. It tells a story of a faith that moved from hidden rooms to public squares, a story of profound respect for those who gave their lives for what they believed. It's a journey from a simple wooden table, shared among friends in a home, to a sacred stone monument connecting heaven and earth, the living and the dead, the past and the present. It's a silent, powerful testament to centuries of history, art, and belief, all centered on that one sacred spot. Have you ever walked into a grand cathedral and felt your eyes drawn upwards, past the soaring arches and stained glass windows, to a magnificent canopy standing over the main altar? That structure, often an architectural marvel in its own right, is called a and today, we're going to uncover its rich history, its profound symbolism, and why it's so much more than just a decorative element. It's the crown of the Christian altar. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is a sabor? In architectural terms, it's a permanent, freestanding canopy, usually supported by 4 columns, that is placed directly over the altar. Think of it as a building within a building, a sacred space designated for the most important moment in Christian worship, the Eucharist. You might also hear it called a baldachin or a baldacchino, especially the more elaborate, fabric-like structures from the Baroque period. While the terms are often used interchangeably today, ciborium is the more ancient and precise term for the columned canopy. So, where did this tradition come from? Its roots go way back to the early days of Christianity. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, as Christians began to build public churches, they needed a way to signify the holiness of the altar. They drew inspiration from both Roman and Jewish traditions. In the Roman world, a canopy, or tigurium, was often placed over the throne of an emperor or a high-ranking official to denote their authority and importance. It was a sign of honor. Similarly, in Jewish tradition, the Ark of the Covenant, which housed the tablets of the 10 Commandments, was kept within the Holy of Holies in the temple, veiled and set apart. Early Christians saw the altar in a similar light. It wasn't just a table, it was the place where Christ becomes present in the Eucharist. So, they adopted the canopy to visually declare, something incredibly sacred happens here. One of the most famous early examples was the one in the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, commissioned by the Emperor Constantine himself. It was made of silver and stood over the very tomb of St. Peter. Imagine the impression that would have made on early pilgrims. It wasn't just marking the altar, it was connecting the act of worship directly to the foundation of the church, to the apostle himself. This set a powerful precedent, and soon, ciboria started appearing in major churches across the Christian world, from Constantinople to Milan. As we move into the Middle Ages, the ciborium evolved. In Romanesque and Gothic architecture, you start to see them crafted from stone, marble, and wood, adorned with intricate carvings, mosaics, and religious imagery. They became more integrated with the overall design of the church. The 4 columns supporting the canopy weren't just structural. They were symbolic. They often represented the 4 corners of the earth, or the 4 Gospels, signifying that the salvation offered at the altar is for the entire world. The canopy itself, the roof of the ciborium, was often designed to look like the dome of heaven. Some were decorated with stars, angels, or a depiction of the Holy Spirit as a dove descending towards the altar. This wasn't just beautiful art. It was theology in stone and paint. The ciborium visually connected the earthly altar to the heavenly reality. It created a vertical axis, drawing the worshipper's gaze from the ground up to the heavens, reminding them that what happens on the altar bridges the gap between earth and heaven. Interestingly, ciboria also had a practical function. In the early church, rods and curtains were often hung between the columns. These curtains would be drawn closed during the most sacred parts of the liturgy, particularly the prayer of consecration. This practice, known as the vela, added a layer of mystery and reverence. It shielded the sacred action from view, emphasizing its holiness, much like the veil of the temple in Jerusalem. While this practice has largely fallen out of use in the Western Church, it highlights the ciborium's role in creating a holy of holies within the church sanctuary. So what happened? If they were so important, why don't we see them in every single church today? Well, architectural styles and liturgical practices change over time. During the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, another feature began to gain prominence: the reredos, or altarpiece. This was a large, often elaborately carved or painted screen placed on or behind the altar. As the reredos grew taller and more spectacular, it began to compete for visual attention with in many churches. The grand altarpiece simply replaced the canopy. Then came the Baroque period in the 17th century, which gave us a spectacular revival of the concept. The most famous example in the entire world is, without a doubt, Bernini's Baldacchino in the current St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It's absolutely massive. Cast in bronze, and its twisting columns are full of dynamic energy. Bernini's creation is a masterpiece that redefined what a ciborium could be. It's not just a canopy. It is a monumental sculpture that directs all the energy of that immense basilica right to the papal altar above St. Peter's tomb. It's a powerful statement of faith and artistry. This masterpiece inspired a new wave of elaborate baldachins across Europe, but the general trend was still moving away from them. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many older ciboria were removed during renovations in favor of a more open sanctuary design that was popular at the time. It was seen as a way to make the altar more visible to the congregation. However, in recent decades, there has been a significant resurgence of interest in the following the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. There was a renewed emphasis on the altar as the central focus of the church. The altar was often moved away from the back wall, becoming freestanding so the priests could face the people. And what better way to highlight a freestanding altar than with a ciborium? Architects and liturgists rediscovered its powerful symbolism. A ciborium beautifully frames the altar, setting it apart without creating a barrier. It honors the altar and helps to orient the entire worship space. It draws everyone's attention from the person in the front pew to the one in the back to the central point of the celebration. You can see this revival in many new and renovated churches today. Modern architects are creating ciboria that are both true to their ancient purpose and stunningly contemporary in design. They might use sleek lines, modern materials like steel and glass, or innovative lighting to create that sacred space over the altar. They're proving that this ancient architectural element is not just a relic of the past, but a timeless and powerful feature for Christian worship today. So, the next time you're in a church and you see a canopy over the altar, take a moment to really look at it. Remember that it's not just decoration. It's a crown, signifying the royalty of Christ present in the Eucharist. It's a miniature heaven, connecting the earthly liturgy to the worship of the angels and saints. And it's a signpost, pointing everyone to the single most important place in the building, the altar, where heaven meets earth. From the silver canopies of Constantinus Rome to the bronze masterpiece of Bernini, and the elegant designs of today, the ciborium has been a constant thread in the rich tapestry of Christian art and architecture. It's a testament to the enduring desire to give physical expression to a spiritual reality, to build a worthy home for a sacred mystery. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into the world of the columns, screens, and the birth of sacred separation when Constantine the Great embraced Christianity and began building monumental churches. He did more than provide space for worship. He shaped how sacred space would be seen and experienced for centuries to come. According to the Libra Pontificalis, one of his most striking contributions to church architecture stood in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In front of the presbyterium, Constantine erected 6 marble columns, richly decorated with carved vine motifs. These columns did not support a roof or enclose a room, and at first glance, they seemed to serve no practical function at all. Their purpose was symbolic, even if the columns were not originally connected by an architrave something that certainly existed by the time of Pope Sergius III in the late 7th century. They marked the sanctuary as a place of honor, rising between nave and altar. They added visual dignity and solemnity to the presbyterium, subtly signaling that this was holy ground. A similar but even more symbolic arrangement appeared in the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem, also built by Constantine. There, 12 columns stood in front of the sacred area, their number clearly evoking the 12 apostles. Architecture itself became catechousis, stone and marble, quietly taught theology to the faithful. Though these colonnades were open and ornamental, their influence proved lasting. From them developed 2 of the most recognizable features in Christian worship spaces: the iconostasis of the Greek Church and the rood screen of medieval Gothic churches. Both can trace their origins back to these 4th century columns that stood between altar and people. In the Greek Church, the iconostasis served a role similar to the Latin chancel, separating the presbyterium from the nave. In its earliest form, it was an open screen, allowing the faithful to see the altar clearly. But history intervened. After the fierce struggle over sacred images, known as iconoclasm, the Church reacted by affirming the legitimacy of holy images. From the 8th century onward, the iconostasis gradually transformed into a closed screen, richly adorned with painted icons of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. What had once been an open boundary became a wall of sacred images, proclaiming theology through art. In the West, a parallel development took place. The rood screen of Gothic churches likewise divided sanctuary from nave, framing the altar while emphasizing its holiness. Though stylistically different from the icon, it shared the same ancestral idea: a visible threshold between heaven and earth. Traces of these early colonnades still survive in the Cathedral of Torcello, near Venice. A 7th century colonnade of 6 columns offers a rare glimpse into how the Constantinian basilicas may have appeared. Standing in quiet dignity, these columns preserve the memory of a time when architecture itself taught the faithful where to look, where to pause, and where the sacred began. Through these columns, simple in function, yet rich in meaning, the early Church learned to shape worship not only through words and rituals, but through space, form, and silence. They remind us that long before screens became walls, and before images filled them, the Church was already learning how to guide the faithful toward reverence, using nothing more than stone, order, and beauty. The dove and the tabernacle, keeping the Eucharist close in the earliest centuries of Christianity. The faithful faced persecution and secrecy, yet the Eucharist, the sacred body of Christ, remained central to their lives. When danger threatened, believers would reserve the Eucharist in their own homes, ensuring that the sick or those unable to attend Mass could still receive communion. These practice, common in the first age of the Church, gradually disappeared in the West by the 4th century, as Christianity became public and churches could safely safeguard the Blessed Sacrament. As the Church developed, special receptacles for the reserved Eucharist began to appear within the churches themselves. These were not merely practical, they carried symbolic meaning. One of the most striking forms was the dove, often made of precious metal, which was suspended from the roof of the ciborium above the altar. The dove, a gold symbol of the Holy Spirit, reminded the faithful that the Eucharist was not just bread and wine, but Christ present among his people, guided by divine life. In churches where a ciborium did not exist, a different solution arose: the Torres Eucharistica, or Eucharistic Tower. These small towers were placed in an armorium, a special niche or cabinet near the altar, keeping the consecrated hosts safe while remaining visible and honored. A drawing of the 13th century altar of the Cathedral of Arras shows a fascinating The tower is suspended above the altar on a staff shaped like a bishop's crozier, clearly recalling the older practice of the suspended dove. Even as architecture and liturgy changed, the Church preserved the memory of a Eucharist hanging above the altar, a visual signal of Christ's presence. For many centuries, this dual tradition continued. The dove-shaped receptacles were often made of precious metals, highlighting the sacredness of what they contained. While a Maria, or octagonal, stone or wooden towers, held the Eucharist on the altar is the gospel side. This combination of practicality, artistry, and devotion ensured that the reserved sacrament was always treated with the utmost reverence. Accessible for those in need, but clearly set apart as holy. The form of the modern tabernacle is small, often ornate, cabinet or box we see on Catholic altars. Today did not appear until the end of the 16th century, yet it carries the memory of all these earlier practices, from doves suspended above the altar to towering armaria. Each design tells a story of devotion, creativity, and the Church's desire to keep Christ present at the center of worship. Through these forms, the dove, the tower, and finally the tabernacle, the Eucharist has remained at the heart of Christian life, not only in the ritual of the Mass, but in the sacred space of the altar where heaven and earth meet, and the faithful are invited to encounter the living Christ. From the earliest centuries, Christians understood that an altar was more than a table, it was sacred space, a meeting point between heaven and earth. Yet, surprisingly, in the Roman Church, there was no fixed formula for consecrating altars before the 8th century. That did not mean the practice was absent. Rather, the essence of consecration, setting the altar apart and making it holy, was already deeply rooted in the customs of the Church. In the 4th century, the earliest form of consecration centered on relics of the martyrs. When a new church was built, the solemn transfer of a martyr's remains to the altar marked its dedication. One of the first recorded examples is the translation of the bodies of Estes, Gervasius, and Protasius by St. Ambrose. Though moving an entire body was rare, objects associated with martyrs, known as brandia, were often placed beneath altars, allowing churches to honor the saints even when their actual remains could not be obtained. These relics were treated with great reverence, considered almost extensions of the martyr themselves, and eventually it became standard practice that no church was fully dedicated without relics in the altar. Sometimes, when relics were unavailable, consecrated hosts or fragments of the Gospels were used instead. The English Synod of Calcutta in 816 explicitly allowed for the use of consecrated hosts in altar dedication, demonstrating the Church's flexibility in ensuring that every altar could be sanctified. The ritual itself was deeply ceremonial and echoed the solemnity of a funeral, reflecting the idea that the altar, like a martyr's tomb, was a place of both death and divine life. According to the Theology and Sacramentary, the bishop, accompanied by clergy and chanting litanies, would begin by processing to the place where relics were kept. After prayers, the relics were brought to the church door and entrusted to a priest. The bishop then entered, exorcised in blessed water, mixing it with chrism, and prepared the altar. Using a sponge, he washed the altar table, sprinkled holy water on the people, and returned the relics to the altar, anointing the sepulchre with chrism before sealing it. The ritual concluded with the first solemn celebration of Mass at the new altar, joining dedication, relics, and Eucharist into a single act of sanctification. Across Europe, variations emerged. In the Gallican Church, the ritual resembled baptism and confirmation more than a funeral. Just as a Christian is dedicated through water and oil, so too was the altar sanctified through ablution and unction. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Frankish liturgists began to combine the Roman and Gallican rites, producing the foundation of the Western Church's modern consecration ceremony. In the Greek Church, the process was more distinctly divided. The altar table was first washed, anointed with chrism, and incensed, while the deposition of relics occurred on a separate day. Each step celebrated with solemnity. Remarkably, despite differences in style, there remained a close resemblance between the Gallican and Byzantine liturgies, emphasizing the same core idea. An altar was consecrated through water, oil, incense, and the presence of saints, making it a true dwelling place of God on earth. Through these rituals, the altar was transformed from a simple stone or wooden table into a sacred throne of the divine, linking the sacrifice of Christ, the witness of martyrs, and the devotion of the faithful. Consecration was not merely a ceremony, it was a living bridge between heaven and earth, a reminder that the Church, through careful tradition and reverent practice, makes holy what it touches. From the very beginnings of Christianity, the faithful were guided not only in what to pray, but also where to look while praying. One of the oldest and most enduring customs was to turn the face toward the east, References to this practice appear as early as the second book of the Apostolic Constitutions, circa 200 to 250, which instructed that churches should be oblong with their head to the east. The early church, Father Tertullian also notes that churches were erected in high and open places, facing the light, emphasizing both symbolism and visibility. Why the east? According to Saint Gregory of Nyssa, it was the direction of the earthly paradise, the first home of humanity, where God first placed man. The east was also understood as the direction from which light and life emerge, making it a natural orientation for Christian prayer. By the Middle Ages, additional layers of meaning were added. Christ on the cross looked toward the west, while from the east he would come at the last judgment, giving the orientation a theological and eschatological significance. Interestingly, the practice did not originate with Christians. Clement of Alexandria observed that ancient pagan temples often faced the west, guiding worshippers to turn east when encountering sacred images. Christianity then adapted a familiar human instinct toward the rising sun, toward light, and infused it with a spiritual purpose, turning a physical habit into a ritual of hope and expectation. In terms of architecture, orientation became a defining feature of church design. In the Middle Ages, the apse and altar were almost always placed at the eastern end of the basilica, so that priests and congregation alike faced the rising sun. However, in the Constantinian era, this rule was often reversed. Major basilicas in Rome, Latorne, St. Peter's, St. Paul's, San Lorenzo, as well as churches in Tyre, Antioch, and the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem had their apses facing west, meaning the bishop in the apse faced east while seated on his throne, but the people faced the opposite direction. Over time, the rule shifted. By the late 4th century, in churches such as the Second Basilica of St. Paul, Rome, 389, and San Pietro in Vincoli, the apse was moved to the east, aligning the faithful and the celebrant in the same direction. This orientation eventually became the standard throughout the east and west, symbolizing a shared journey of worship, facing both the rising sun and the promised return of Christ. Practical considerations, however, often affected orientation. The layout of streets and city planning sometimes forced churches to face slightly off axis from true east. Some of the oldest Roman churches, for example, were oriented toward various points of the compass, showing that while symbolism was paramount, practical reality could never be entirely ignored. In the end, the simple act of turning east during prayer connected architecture, theology, and devotion. It reminded the faithful of paradise lost and paradise awaited, of Christ's return, and of light conquering darkness. From the earliest house churches to the grand basilicas of Constantine in the medieval era, orientation became a silent teacher, shaping both the movement of the body and the gaze of the soul toward God. From the very beginnings of Christianity, the faithful were guided not only in what to pray, but also where to look while praying. One of the oldest and most enduring customs was to turn the face toward the east. References to this practice appear as early as the second book of the Apostolic Constitutions, circa 2002-50, which instructed that churches should be oblong with their head to the east. The early church father Tertullian also notes that churches were erected in high and open places, facing the light, emphasizing both symbolism and visibility. Why the east? According to Saint Gregory of Nyssa, it was the direction of the earthly paradise, the first home of humanity, where God first placed man. The east was also understood as the direction from which light and life emerge, making it a natural orientation for Christian prayer. By the Middle Ages, additional layers of meaning were added. Christ on the cross looked toward the west, while from the east he would come at the last judgment, giving the orientation a theological and eschatological significance. Interestingly, the practice did not originate with Christians. Clement of Alexandria observed that ancient pagan temples often faced the west, guiding worshippers to turn east when encountering sacred images. Christianity then adapted a familiar human instinct toward the rising sun, toward light, and infused it with a spiritual purpose, turning a physical habit into a ritual of hope and expectation. In terms of architecture, orientation became a defining feature of church design. In the Middle Ages, the apse and altar were almost always placed at the eastern end of the basilica, so that priest and congregation alike faced the rising sun. However, in the Constantinian era, This rule was often reversed. Major basilicas in Rome Lateran, St. Peter's, St. Paul's, San Lorenzo, as well as churches in Tyre, Antioch, and the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem had their apses facing west, meaning the bishop in the apse faced east while seated on his throne, but the people faced the opposite direction. Over time, the rules shifted. By the late 4th century, in churches such as the Second Basilica of St. Paul Shomi, Trezentosi and San Pietro in Vincoli, the apse was moved to the east, aligning the faithful and the celebrant in the same direction. This orientation eventually became the standard throughout the east and west, symbolizing a shared journey of worship, facing both the rising sun and the promised return of Christ. Practical considerations, however, often affected orientation. The layout of streets and city planning sometimes forced churches to face slightly off-axis from true east. Some of the oldest Roman churches, for example, were oriented toward various points of the compass, showing that while symbolism was paramount, practical reality could never be entirely ignored. In the end, the simple act of turning east during prayer connected architecture, theology, and devotion. It reminded the faithful of paradise lost and paradise awaited, of Christ's return, and of light conquering darkness. From the earliest house churches to the grand basilicas of Constantine and the medieval era, orientation became a silent teacher, shaping both the movement of the body and the gaze of the soul toward God. Ancient and medieval altars, from simplicity to splendor, few of the earliest Christian altars have survived the centuries. Yet those that remain offer a vivid glimpse into the evolution of sacred architecture and devotion. One of the oldest known is a 5th century altar discovered at Oriel, near Massa. This stone table, resting on a single column, is engraved with the monogram of Christ and surrounded by 12 doves. A beautiful fusion of simplicity and symbolism. Similar in form are 3 9th century altars preserved in the Confessio of St. Cecilia in Rome, showing that this elegant style endured across centuries. Even earlier, wooden table altars appear in mosaics from the 6th century, such as those in San Vitali and Santa Poinari, in Classe, Ravenna, resting on 4 feet and covered by long cloths that hid the table completely. These altars combine practicality with reverence, a visual statement that the sacredness of the altar was paramount, even if its material was modest. Some scholars believe that tables concealed within the altars of the Lateran and Santa Pudenziana resembled these early forms. As the church grew and artistic expression flourished, altars became ornamental canvases for devotion. The tomb-type altars of the Constantinian era, like sarcophagi, offered broad, flat fronts suitable for decoration. The first surviving altar with a carved antependium dates to the beginning of the 8th century and showing Christ at the center, flanked by angels, with the hand of God above. In Milan, the Ambrosian Basilica elevated this art to new heights. A golden front over 7 feet long, silver sides, and panels depicting the life of Christ and St. Ambrose, complete with Apostles Evangelist symbols and angel assay three-dimensional storytelling through precious metals. This trend continued across Europe. The Paladoro of St. Mark's, Venice, 10th century, was originally an In the 11th century, Emperor Henry II gifted a golden antependium to the Cathedral of Bal, adorned with our Lord, archangels, and saints. While these opulent examples were rare, most altars were simpler, crafted from wood with painted or carved representations of Christ and the saints, such as a 12th century panel preserved in Munster, Westphalia. For centuries, the ciborium canopy over the altar remained a key feature. Examples from Santa Poinari in Classe, early 9th century, show continuity with earlier designs. After the 10th century, the use of ciboria declined outside Italy and the East, though Gothic churches occasionally retained them, as in Halberstadt, Ratisbon, and Vienna. The early Christian altar was usually free of superstructure. When bishops' thrones were at the center of the apse, adding a reredos retabulum would have blocked sight. But as the Eastern apse became standard, with the celebrant facing the same direction as the congregation, the reredos emerged, inspired by the antependium and by the display of relics, which Pope Leo IV had encouraged. The oldest surviving reredos is the Pala di Oro Festa Marques, detached from the front and placed behind the altar in 1105 by Dojour de la Fofa. Other notable examples include the 12th century reredos at Klosterneuburg, featuring Old and New Testament scenes. Through the 13th and 14th centuries, reredos design evolved, Initially modest in height, they grew progressively taller and more elaborate, eventually reaching the vaults of churches during the late Gothic and Renaissance periods. Life-sized statues of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints joined reliefs of sacred stories, often crafted in wood, painted or gilded, while platforms called predelae displayed apostles and saints, connecting the altar to its visual narrative. By the 16th century, Renaissance influences transformed the altar yet again. Classical porticos, inspired by triumphal arches, replaced the reredos in some regions, incorporating statues in high and low relief and employing rare marbles and costly materials. By the 17th and 18th centuries, ornamentation became extravagant, at times losing taste in favor of abundance. Altars had moved far from their humble wooden beginnings yet. In every age, they continued to serve as the focal point of Christian worship, combining artistry, devotion, and the reverence owed to the sacred mysteries. In this journey from the 5th century table at Oriel to the towering Renaissance altars, we witness centuries of faith, expressed in stone, wood, gold, and silver. Each altar a testament not only to the evolving aesthetics of the church, but to the enduring centrality of the Eucharist and the saints in the life of Christian communities. As we step back from centuries of devotion, artistry, and sacred tradition, the Christian altar emerges not merely as a piece of architecture, but as a living witness to faith, from humble wooden tables in the secret house churches of early Christians, to stone altars over the tombs of martyrs, to the gleaming golden antipendia and towering reredos of the medieval basilica. Each altar tells a story of worship, of sacrifice, and of humanity reaching toward the divine. Every detail, from the placement of relics in the confessio, to the protective ciborium, to the orientation facing the rising sun, reflects a people striving to make tangible the invisible mysteries of God. Through fire, invasion, and centuries of change, the altar remains the heart of Christian devotion, the point where heaven and earth meet, where the faithful are invited to encounter the living Christ. In tracing this journey, we see more than stone, wood, and gold. We see the soul of the church itself, expressed in reverence, creativity, and unbroken faith. And as we stand before a modern altar today, whether simple or grand, we are reminded that it is not the material that sanctifies, but the devotion it inspires, the prayers it receives, and the sacrament it bears. The Christian altar, in all its forms and transformations, continues to call us to awe, to worship, and to the eternal dialogue between humanity and the divine. It is, in every sense, a bridge from the past to the present, from the earthly to the heavenly, and a testament that, through all ages, the sacred remains at the very heart of the church. Thank you for walking through this story with stories of the saints, where history becomes hope, and faith continues to shape the world. If this story strengthened your faith, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories of the Saints so more souls can discover the lives that changed history.